welcome to episode 136 of Silver Lining for Learning. I'm really pleased to introduce our guests for today and our topic for today. Months ago, I read a newspaper article about how Harvard, MIT, and Stanford had all produced reports about the impact on teaching and learning of the pandemic and the future visions for digital learning within their respective institutions. And I thought, what a wonderful contrast this would be. And the image that came to my mind was three people at an amusement park who get onto a roller coaster and they're kind of shocked by how powerful the roller coaster is, what a disruptive experience it is. And after they get off, they each write up what it was like for them. And in a way, sort of a humorous way, that's a bit what happened to all of us in higher education with the pandemic. So what struck me in looking deeper is that each report draws on the mission of its university and the culture of its university. So it's not surprising that they're not the same. In fact, it's exactly what you would expect, that your own perspective colors what you see and what you emphasize. And I think those contrasts are part of the interesting things we can discuss today. So we'll begin by asking each of our three guests to briefly introduce themselves and to talk about one or two aspects of their report that they think apply not just to the prestigious universities that are represented here today, but to all institutions of higher education nationally and perhaps even internationally. So Janet, I'll start with you.
Thanks so much, Chris, and thanks for inviting me to be here with my colleagues from MIT, from Harvard and Stanford. I actually was struck by the number of intersections of our three reports, and you're absolutely right, Chris. There's a lot of marked differences, but I think some of the things that struck me the most about our report, about our findings, and then the overlap with the other institutions, is the number one, this kind of sharpened focus on the importance of community, well-being, and belonging. I think that many instructors, faculty and instructors who never really thought much about that before, or didn't think it in a particularly focused way, were forced to think about it. And I think that was a really important important thing, and something that I think we need to keep in our minds. We need to keep working at that, and we need to keep paying attention to that and working to support community well-being and belonging for all of our students. So that's one of my biggest takeaways. Our report talks about this idea of enhancing student engagement. And, this is a place where in the pandemic, again, I think that the fact that we all had to be so overt about it, about that engagement, made us pay attention to it more. And we came up with ways, instructors and faculty came up with ways to really enhance that engagement, student engagement, student faculty engagement, and even instructor engagement. And again, I think it's this idea that it couldn't just happen, which is what I think a lot of folks kind of assume. Oh, students will get together after class and work on their P-sets, problem sets, or I'll chat with the students before class and I'll get a sense for how things are going. Like, that couldn't happen. That didn't happen until people decided it had to happen. And I think that's something, it's just fabulous that we've come to acknowledge that, and then we're thinking about ways that technology can support that, and other strategies can support that. And I think also this idea of looking at our assessments, and specifically looking at the transparency of our assessments and the transparency of our the way we talk about our assessments, the way we put parameters around our assessments and the way we communicate those priorities with our students. And I think if I had to say, those were three things I think were really big takeaways. I just also want to say that I was only a co-chair of this report. My fellow chair was Professor Krishna Rajagopal from the physics department. He had been the dean for digital learning when the report started, but by the time we finished the report, he was back on physics, had stepped down from that position, and a wonderful committee of task force committee of faculty and staff. So I think I'll stop there. Probably talked more than I should have.
No, not at all. Cindy?
Thanks, Chris, and thanks again so much for having me. And I'm really excited for today's conversation. Yeah, kind of building off what Janet said, I think my co-author, Lisa Anderson, and I have reflected on this quite a bit, that the thing that kind of surprised us that came out so strongly in our conversations with colleagues across Stanford was just that importance of empathy, that really, I think, we all sort of knew that we had to build inclusive teaching and learning environments. We needed to recognize diverse students and help them obtain their learning objectives. But I think it kind of was different when those backgrounds were literally brought with the students to class with them as Zoom backgrounds. I think we heard from several instructors that really hit home with them, just seeing the different environments that students were trying to learn in, and some were more conducive to learning than others. And that kind of caused just this new awareness and new energy around developing new resources and new materials and new trainings, all about developing inclusive classroom spaces in the Zoom space. And then now that we're back to mostly face-to-face, ensuring that those ideas kind of carry forward. The other thing I think was sort of just a mindset shift that happened, that if we had been asked in February 2020 if we could move all of our teaching and learning online, no one would have thought we could have done it, but then we did because we had to. And we did it. It was, kind of an emergency response, and it wasn't perfect at first, but I think collectively we all took on new roles. We all built new collaborative relationships. And through that, we really improved and refined what was initially this reactive kind of emergency move online, and we made it work pretty well. So I think that energy and that sort of optimism about what's possible is something that is carrying forward, and I think we captured in the report.
Bharat?
Thanks, Chris. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you, and Janet and Cindy as well. So I'm going to echo a few things that they mentioned, but let me just provide some context for why we wrote the report at Harvard. So just by way of introduction, I'm the Vice Provost for Advances in Learning at the university. And the committee, the task force that ended up helping with this report was similar to what Janet was saying. We had a group of 17 faculty and staff. Harvard is very decentralized, as you know. The 12 schools at Harvard essentially take ownership of a lot of the activities within their schools. And so part of the question is, why are we doing this at the university level? The committee was formed in February 2021, so while we were still in the middle of the pandemic. And part of the reason was that we were already beginning to see I think the yearning to return to the way things were in pockets of the university. It was a hard period, as we all know, but at the same time, as Cindy and Janet was saying, there were so many innovations and experiments and initiatives that occurred during this period that we felt this was just such a unique moment, and it was our responsibility to be able to capture those learnings, so we could lay the groundwork for laying out essentially a vision for the future of teaching and learning at Harvard, and perhaps to help other institutions think through this. The part of the report that was, the first part of the report actually describes the context, which is the pre-pandemic context. So, as you know, we had been engaged in some forms of digital learning for 7-8 years prior to the pandemic, and that helped. And I think that's one important learning, which is innovation and experimentation don't occur in a vacuum. The second piece I would say is just insights about the question of where we know all the dimensions in which online learning can be worse, but where might it be perhaps even better than face-to-face? I think that was a big focus of the report, and happy to talk about that at some length. I'll just give a preview of some of that, which is when we think about many of the ideas and innovations, the things that struck us, and again, this is not new to the pandemic, is digital technologies have a few advantages. One is they allow us to collapse time, right? You take something simple like the chat feature on Zoom, and you can have multi-person conversations simultaneously, which is very hard in our residential classrooms where you're literally having to call on people one at a time. The second is bridging space. I mean, one of the things that happened very quickly early on in the pandemic was many courses started inviting guest speakers who were located everywhere around the world, as just one example. And there were many other examples of this, right? You can essentially transcend space. And the third is personalizing learning in ways that go beyond what we might do, again, in our classrooms. So those principles, in fact, outline or underscore a lot of the insights. And the last thing I'll say, and I'd love for us to talk about this at some point, is I think as Janet was saying, there was intentionality here to a lot of these innovations. It wasn't like it just happened. I remember one colleague right at the beginning who had no experience with online learning said we were all reduced to the same level of incompetence. And that allowed us all to really think about sort of a whiteboard, blank slate, what can we do better? And the process of this change, I think, was almost as important and will be as important going forward as the particular insights that emerged.
So I know that Kurt and Young have questions, but I just want to take advantage of being moderator to start with one. And I shared with our guests an article that I published that basically argues that the world is now irreversibly hybrid, and that educational institutions that don't teach in a hybrid way are leaving their students at a huge disadvantage when they graduate. I had actually been studying remote learning since 1978 when Nebraska Public Television approached me. So I've seen many generations of remote learning over the years. And I was delighted, not by the pandemic, but by the chance to teach online, which was not possible at Harvard outside of the continuing education school before the pandemic. And I found that a course that I had taught for more than a decade face-to-face quite successfully was actually better online. And so I think there's a kind of conflation that's taken place in many people between the trauma and the challenges of the pandemic and having to do something that you haven't been prepared to do, which is always going to be difficult and scary, with what remote learning is really like when done well, and that it has some advantages, as Bharat was saying, compared to face-to-face learning. Now, silver lining for learning is about the fact, when we started this, we said this is a sea change, this is a transformation. It's not just something that comes and goes, and we want to celebrate successes, but also talk about how we move forward. And I think this issue of to what extent are MIT, Harvard, and Stanford, if at all, thinking that they should be deliberately hybrid with faculty who, like me, who actually relish the chance to do at least some online teaching, or whether that's kind of going back to now we've got this in our back pocket if another catastrophe happens, we'll be ready to run with it. But gee, it just still is inferior to all face-to-face. So any of you, I'd be interested in your thoughts about that.
I'm happy to take a first crack, Chris. Yeah, so I think what I was alluding to, right, like what you were saying about some of the advantages of online learning, I think we had learned prior to the pandemic. I'll just give you one example. When we had started Harvard Business School online 9 or 10 years ago, we'd asked this question, which is, how do we create an experience that's digital first? This is a term that often gets thrown around, not just in the education field, but beyond as well. What does digital first mean? And we were asking this question in the educational context, of course, right? Like, what does digital first mean in this context? And I think what that requires is almost forgetting some of the habits that we're used to when we teach in the residential classroom, and breaking some assumptions. I would say the pandemic was critical in breaking assumptions. One example of this, in the Harvard Business School classroom, one of the famous instruments by which we draw in students is something called the cold call, right? We might just call in the student and say, Chris, what do you think? And Chris is suddenly taken aback and has to pay attention and, on his feet, think about how he would answer. That lever is a very powerful lever for participation in the classroom. Now, the downside is that if I call Chris and he flubs, which of course you would never do, that might take a few minutes, and then I've got to call on the next student and so on, and it just takes time. Online, you could be cold calling through the computer 30 or 300 students at the same time, right? And they can see what each other is saying. That's just a very simple example of what I was referring to as collapsing time. So there's many of these features, I think, that came into play. The one thing I'll say is, in some sense, you were alluding to what we might call emergency remote teaching, which was really the initial period. And that was a hard period, right? Because everyone was going to it, most of them with no experience. Some did have the experience and were trying to think about what we can take. But if you break up the period of the pandemic into almost 3 periods, which is the first 3 months, March to May 2020, which was essentially that period that you described. And then we had another 3 months to prepare for the next year, where suddenly faculty were more intentional in redesigning their courses, and they looked different, and the experiences were different. And then the subsequent period where we went back to the classroom and thinking about blended learning, you can literally see the changes even within the last 2.5 years. And I think that's just evidence of what was going on.
I think one of our interviewees said there's no normal to go back to. I think, it was this massive kind of faculty development event that happened where everyone had to rethink how they were teaching. I think we saw a lot of people, as you were saying, Bharat, kind of using technology in more deeper and meaningful ways. People learned how to use Canvas, our learning management system, more effectively, and that continues. Like, that can't really be undone. So I think even though we are largely back to face-to-face, that learning remains, and people learned how to organize their content a little bit better and chunk it a little bit more, add a little bit more variety and interaction in the classroom, just because they had to keep people engaged in Zoom. And that continues. We also heard about some of our more experiential courses, like labs, that had to completely rethink what they were doing from the bottom up, and are using some of what they learned from doing that now that they're back in their labs, where they feel a little bit more comfortable. They have all the equipment they need, but some of the scaffolding that they built in to support students when they were doing these things at home with less one-on-one support from the instructor, they're keeping that, and they're continuing to do some of these things.
Right. Yeah. A few things that you both said really resonate with me. I think one thing is, it's the teaching and learning center directors, just like broken record, is that, well, you have to start with the learning outcomes. And so the idea that, I think folks, in terms of hybrid, fully remote, fully in person, just in general, again, I think, we want to look at what are our goals for student learning, and then which modality best supports that, and I think if we can be objective about that, then we'll get some really good work done. I think with respect to those three different periods that Bharat described in terms of the pandemic's trajectory, I think it makes me think of two things. One is the work of Ruben Puentedura with the SAMR model, which I don't know if everybody listening knows about it, but it's this idea of any kind of new adoption technology in education, for the most part, comes with it's either a substitution, an augmentation, a modification, or a redefinition. And so I think at the beginning, we were all just trying to substitute, right? Everybody was just trying to say, okay, I used to lecture, now I have to lecture, but it has to be online, right? And so nobody had time to really think beyond that, to really think about how does this augment, how does being remote augment the experience? How can it modify it? How does it redefine it, right? And so I think as we moved through the pandemic, people had more and more experience, more and more, I guess, more and more driving force, really, to think, okay, what can I do? How can I leverage these tools? How can I create a different experience, a better experience for my learners? So I think that's a really interesting thing to think about. And I think it's one of these processes that it's hard to speed up, right? The first day we all went remote, nobody was going to say, oh, let me re-envision the way, I'm sure there were a few people that were able to do that, but not too many, the way we're delivering content, the way, what does it mean to engage with my students? We just weren't there until we had a semester under our belts. I think the thing about the digital engagement, and it goes back, it's front and center in the Stanford report, is this idea of equity and access, and what do people have? And it's not just the technology, it's not just, do you have Wi-Fi, or it's a whole bunch of living situation conditions that I think we need to be attentive to when we talk about jumping into the remote delivery or even hybrid delivery, when we're not talking about students that are on a campus. So it's just something I don't want to lose track of.
Chris, can I just pick up on the last point that Janet made? I think it's a really important point that many of these digital technologies, and we've been talking so far about sort of a comparison, right, between digital versus analog, so to speak, or digital versus residential. And Janet's point about that first instinct to think about these as substitutes as opposed to complements, that plays out in not just education, in many sectors, right? When e-commerce came along, when DVRs came along, everyone thought this was going to substitute for traditional media and traditional retail. Beyond the complementarity, I think the equity aspect is really critical here. I think we've heard a lot about the inequities that were exacerbated during the pandemic. On the flip side, though, the opportunity for increased equity, access, inclusion is dramatically greater. And I'll just give you one example of this. Harvard's Graduate School of Education, as you know, where you teach, has a one-year master's degree program, and it had to essentially pivot that entire degree program to an online degree program. And your Dean Bridget Long, I remember in the summer of 2020, essentially asked the question, the students we've admitted for next year who are coming to the one-year master's, which is now online, were all admitted thinking they were coming to campus. Might there be students who never even applied to the program because they knew they could not come to campus, who we can now open up this program to? And so they had a new round of admissions. And what was striking about that was within 3 weeks, the number of applications they got was 2 to 3 times as high as they get during an entire regular cycle. And as you know, those students were more diverse in backgrounds, more experienced, and more global. And so this is a critical issue about meeting learners where they are, right? That's what digital technologies allow you to do. And And in terms of just being the fulcrum for increasing access, I think that's a really important point.
So I'll jump in here, coming to you, taking a break from a wedding up here in Indianapolis. You know, and I read, I think it was a Stanford report, and I sent it to Young and Chris and Punya. Chris says, why don't you see if you can get them to come on the show? And while you're at it, how about someone from Harvard and MIT? And that's a lot of work, you know. I mean, I don't know. And then all of a sudden, about 3 weeks later, Chris says, I've got them all. So I said, okay, that's great. I actually thought I was going to have to send boxes of chocolates to you. So we're honored to have you all on the show with us. Thank you very much. Great reports and great work, Chris, getting everyone. Chris and I are both from Wisconsin, particularly Milwaukee, and Wisconsin's really a big outreach and extension state. They believe in getting education to all four corners. We don't really have four corners, but the mission is to get it all throughout the state. Just like Oklahoma, Nebraska, I think Pennsylvania were huge outreach correspondence course is in education in the 1980s, TV based. So in Wisconsin, I took television courses to get into grad school in 83 and 84 or 85. Something like that. And then when I got there, the people teaching those courses asked me if I could help them create a course in 87 or 88, a nationally syndicated course on critical thinking for teachers. It's called Teachers Tackle Thinking, Critical Thinking in the Classroom. And when I got to Indiana, we were set up to be the most technology sophisticated school of ed in the country. Now Stanford probably is, or Harvard, but I did one of the first blended courses in 93 and the first fully online in 97. But in the middle of all that, I went to West Virginia for a brief bit. And when I got there, they said, oh, you know a lot about this stuff. We'll put you as the chair of the classroom of the future. I got there in 89. When I left in 92, it was finally being built. It took 3 years to get over the politics and get it built, get the money and so forth. I see in Bharat's bio, the Harvard's online program is called the Classroom of the Future, according to Forbes. So my question for all of you, I have 4 or 5 questions. I'm going to merge 2 here together. What does a classroom of the future look like today? Or what is your vision of a post-pandemic classroom like? I'm just curious what all of you think in terms of, you've seen a lot what works, seen a few things that didn't work, and some things you're still trialing and piloting and seeing if they do work. And by the way, we did have a show of Indiana University people on a couple months ago talking about classrooms that we're building on our campus to be more active and engaging. And they were comparing us to Iowa, Minnesota. Some of the Big 10 universities have been experimenting with active learning classroom spaces, and of course with blended and high flex and other kinds of things. So maybe we start with Bharat, because since you're the one that in here, it talks about classroom of the future. What's your vision of a classroom of the future now, and how are things changing?
Thanks, Karan. Yeah, I think the classroom you're referring to was the synchronous live classroom that we had built at Harvard Business School called HBS Live. And just to give, the lights just went off. Just to give people a flavor of what this looks like, think of it as 60 TV screens or 90 TV screens in a big studio, and the students are located anywhere in the world. The faculty has digital boards, chalkboards essentially to write on, and you're basically, in the phrase I was using, collapsing time and bridging space. That's what that particular classroom was about, but that's an entirely synchronous setting, right? So I'm going to take your question, and in fact, my answer is it depends what that classroom looks like, depending on whether we're talking about a fully synchronous setting or an entirely asynchronous setting or a blended setting or any combination of the above. In an asynchronous setting, I think things get perhaps even more interesting. And I'll just maybe talk about the ends of the spectrum. First phase of online education, when we went fully asynchronous, back when you and others were trying to think about what online education looks like, was what I would call the PDF of the residential setting. right? As Jan was saying, essentially, we're just transferring what we do in the physical classroom online. So you literally had video recordings of faculty on transparencies writing down the way they would on the chalkboard. That's essentially just saying we're trying to mimic and replicate everything we do in the physical classroom. That's on one end of the spectrum. I think we're now very far towards the other end, where the principles I was talking about, interactive learning, where it's not like you're just sitting and watching 60-minute videos. How do you interact with the material, even in an asynchronous setting, every 2 or 3 minutes? Peer-to-peer learning, right? What's fascinating about digital technologies compared to TV and radio and so on is students can interact with each other as opposed to just being a broadcast mode. How do we take advantage of that in an asynchronous setting? And then you take it a step further and say, you can think about that not just for learning within the classroom, but learning outside the classroom. In fact, this is something we experienced over the last decade, where many of the platforms that we had built at Harvard that were designed to really exploit this notion of peer-to-peer learning. What was fascinating was they triggered relationships amongst the students, which led to offline meetups. And the one thing we hadn't thought about was, wait, once the course was over, we basically asked these students to leave the platform, and they're telling us, you have just created a community. Now we're going to replicate that community through WhatsApp groups and so on and so forth. So I think the future classroom really thinks about this holistically, that it's not just in or outside the classroom, it's both. It's not just content and delivery, it's inductive learning and interactivity. And it's not just classes and courses, but it's community. So maybe that's where I'll stop. And what form that takes, whether it's labs or humanities classrooms or business school discussions, might be somewhat different, but those are the principles.
Wow, that's great. Cindy, Janet, either one of you want to jump in here?
Yeah, I think Stanford's doing a lot of work in physical classroom spaces, of course, and there's a lot of fun innovations going on right now with those and different experiments, and thinking about audio in classrooms and how to make classrooms very accessible to people, and lots of fun stuff there. But yeah, I think there is a lot of thinking about not just the physical classroom, but yeah, beyond. I think the Stanford Graduate School of Business has the Action Learning program, which is very experiential. The students are embedded, solving real world problems, like presenting reports in Sacramento, and yeah, how to build these real, authentic learning experiences, solving real problems in real communities. And I think that's where classrooms are heading. But I think also where there's a lot of energy coming out of the pandemic at Stanford is, Stanford's super residential. I think 97% of undergraduates live on campus. And the pandemic taught us that we can teach differently and have an impact, not just on campus. So I think that's been sort of interesting to think about. How do we expand Stanford's impact? How do we use digital education to build real on-ramps and pathways to higher education, whether at Stanford or elsewhere? How do we support first-generation, low-income students in coming to Stanford? Thinking about Stanford staff and working learners, people who work at Stanford but don't have bachelor's degrees yet. Like, how can digital education kind of be expanded to collapse space and have an impact beyond what we think of as our typical Stanford student right now? And I think that's where there's a lot of excitement happening at Stanford.
Yeah, I think that both Cindy and Bharat, said 90% of what I would say. I guess I would say I think it might be more useful not to talk about the classroom of the future, but just the learning experiences of the future, because I think the classroom is just, it's potentially, it's a construct that might get in our way, maybe. And so just the learning experiences, I think, again, my hope is that that what we did what faculty and instructors did in the pandemic, it kind of opened the door to think about, science of learning, best research-based teaching practices, all those things that that's what I want to see in the learning experiences of the future, applied thoughtfully, et cetera. And so I think we did open the door in that area, even if some of it was almost a retroactive acknowledgement that that's what was going on. And then I do want to just echo what Cindy said and come back around to something I said before, but looking at the learning outcomes for a particular learning experience, and I guess I'll just say goals for a particular learning experience, which means looking at the goals for a particular set of learners. And so I think when we think about different populations, executive ed classes versus K through 12 classes versus who is the audience, what do they need, and then how can we help them learn the best.
Thank you so much for coming. This is really kind of strange. Okay, so a lot of when I was reading your reports, all these great innovations, the beautiful things that you've discovered. In fact, like Chris and Kurt, they're talking, educational psychologists, probably have discovered them about a decade earlier. So I think the biggest change is it's like a forced experiment on professors, on students. I joked about this in February 2020 in Philadelphia when I was giving a keynote to the independent schools, when China was the only country at that time just were shutting down schools. And this is how this show started. I said, what if schools would be closed for a year? What changes would happen? And then I flipped into Spain from that. Then I came back, schools were shut down. So I was actually wondering, which is not a question I want to ask you, but I will raise this question. What if Stanford or MIT or Harvard, if you were closed for, let's say, 3 years, what would happen? And I don't know if you guys, when you did your commit meetings, you thought about, what if schools were never able to open? How would our schools hang out? So here's my real question, is what I was reading when I was hoping to see some institutional recommendations. Because when you talk about equity and exclusivity, or exclusion, with the pending case in the High Court of the affirmative action, which is going to affect students' admission tremendously in the future. And also, of course, the expensiveness of going to Stanford, 97% is expensive place, the whole Bay Area. Of course, Boston is not less expensive. With all the new innovations, apparently education out of MIT, out of Harvard, and out of Stanford could be delivered in other places. Like, could it be possible to have Stanford, Idaho, Stanford, Montana, or Stanford, I don't know, somewhere in Africa? I was just wondering, have you guys thought about those institutional changes? I'm sure you question through the pandemic, what is the core of Harvard? What makes Harvard, Harvard, MIT, MIT? Could that be expanded globally or sent to other cities? And have you guys had some discussions like that? And I wish actually every educational institution can be like you guys, going through the process, because outside the world, the business world has changed. People don't want to go back to office anymore. People, even Elon Musk could not make everybody go back. So this is quite fascinating for us to think about institutional changes. Anyone, please. Bharat?
Sure, happy to jump in. So let me first separate the two parts of your question, which is what would the world look like if we were stuck in it for a longer period, versus should there be a Harvard UK, Harvard India, Harvard Spain, and so on. I think those are two somewhat different questions. I think you're getting at two things which are quite fundamental. The first is, what is a Harvard experience? And this was also touched on in the MIT and Stanford reports, right? As we think about the future, what is it about the magic of what we do on campus that can transcend being on campus, right? And this was Janet's response to Kurt as well. When we think about the classroom and go beyond a physical space, when we think about what the asynchronous classroom is, there's no single space in which people are. They're scattered everywhere. So how do we think about that? And we actually described this in the report, right? We spent some time thinking about what is that Harvard experience. Now, when you go down to first principles, one of the things we've always felt that what we deliver through any of our institutions, right? I can talk about the case of Harvard, is a place where you inspire people through ideas. There's a commitment to the truth. There's relational connections that are built, right? Those are the kinds of things that define the Harvard experience. By the way, when we were talking about this in the task force, and you can see it just from the attributes that I've listed, nothing that I've said depends on being in Cambridge. Right? None of those attributes require to be in one place. Does it help to be in one place? Absolutely. I mean, we all experience the power, and we're seeing this not just in the classrooms, in the workspace, some of the attributes of being together that, you just can't beat. But the question of how can we take these experiences and extend them in different ways, I think is absolutely the point of the report that we wrote and what Cindy and Janet were involved in. I wouldn't want to think about a world where we have to live in that world always, because I think obviously there were a lot of coincident factors having to do with health and isolation and so on. But if you can imagine a world where you can choose which modality you're in, right? It would be, I think, a complete coincidence that the optimal solution is 100% physically co-located or 100% online. And I think that's where blended learning comes in a sense. It just allows flexibility in so many different ways. The other part of your question, Young, is I think an organizational change question. Your question about, we knew all this before the pandemic, so why didn't we change? I don't think it's surprising at all why change didn't occur. If you look at theories of change in organizations, which all of you are familiar with, there's many barriers to change, right? As a student and scholar of organizational strategy, I mean, we often think about things like, do we need to change? Why do we need to change? Is there a burning platform? And there wasn't with residential education as such. I mean, increasingly it's being frayed at the edges, but there was nothing that really. If you think about the incentives and the motivation, if you think about how can we come up with ideas where we would really want to sort of break the model apart and reconstruct it, and then also go beyond the existing processes and the inertia, I mean, those are all very natural barriers, right? I think the thing that was really interesting about the pandemic was we went from a situation where maybe 10% of the faculty had experience with online education, clearly all of you on this call, to a place where we now have 100%. Strip everything aside, I think that was the most important effect of the pandemic. Because now we can truly have an authentic conversation, regardless of the experience. We know what it is, better or worse. We can have a conversation about what this should look like 10 years from now, right? And I'll just stop by saying there's a lot of assumptions that we have about the way things are. And breaking those assumptions is really, really hard. And this, I think, was one of the experiences of a lot of our faculty colleagues during the pandemic and students, which is they said, oh my gosh, I thought this was going to be a terrible experience. And yeah, it was difficult in certain respects, but I suddenly discovered that there were all these ways that I could enhance the student experience, break apart the course, reconstruct it, think about assessments in a different way. Unless you're forced to, it's hard to change.
Yeah, thank you. Let me jump in before I let Cindy and Janet jump in. I just want to add one thing. I don't think any one of your universities did this, but quite a number of US universities did hire other institutions in other countries to serve as their gathering places for courses, for labs. So that was so I was just very interested in the global distribution of students. If they were globally distributed, it would cut down the cost. You might still be able to retain the Harvard spirit or something. But anyway, Cindy and Janet, we're running out of time. So go ahead, Cindy and Janet.
Yeah, no, I'll just jump in. I think a couple things. I think, again, we want to go back to this idea of meeting the learners where they are. And I think for some learners, some folks that this sort of fully remote all the time is exactly what folks need because of access or because of other things going on in their lives or other priorities or whatever. And I think that there are learners. I mean, I think if we think about our institutions as living and learning communities, the living part is hard to do remotely. I mean, we did it, but that whole sense of community that I think, this is not my field at all, but if you look at our undergraduates, they need that. They need that community associated with their living together, living with others, getting along with others. All that stuff is a really key component of their education. So I think it starts to get hard to parse out that. We could make arguments for the efficiency or the effectiveness of the learning part, but until we redefine what it means to go to college, there's going to always be that living part, that living learning community part that I think is hard to. That's hard to replicate. But maybe I'm not imagining. Maybe I'm just not imaginative enough. But there certainly are students who, when you meet them where they are, they don't need a bricks and mortar. They don't need bricks and mortar to have a really good education, to have exactly what they need. So I think that's perhaps important to keep in mind. Yeah, I mean, I think we talked this idea at MIT. We use the word special sauce. What's the special sauce that makes MIT and MIT education and MIT education? And finding that special sauce. I mean, I think we tried to find it. We tried to get something that was close to that when we went online. And that's something, again, I think if we go back to this idea about it's really hard to think about that until you've played with a lot of things for a while, because you can't even imagine anything beyond a substitution sort of. So.
Yeah, I think, Janet, that just this idea that I think this was in the MIT report also, that student flourishing, like empathy, is so important to this. And I think if we went back online tomorrow, we'd know that the community is the piece that's the hardest to do, maybe. And I know Stanford did a lot of work in that area. We built a lot of new mental health services that were more flexible, that were online or hybrid. And I think that's probably, we just know that going into it. And that's the thing that we have to figure out. Normally Stanford students have sort of like an oral tradition where they pass along information about where do you go for late night study spaces? What are the clubs you need to join? Like, they give each other mentorship, and that was missing for the students who came to Stanford, not to Stanford campus physically, but who joined the Stanford community when we were remote. So how do we build those things, and how do we build in that sense of community? I think we would know that we needed to center that if we went back online tomorrow. But I think also, these reports really capture a lot of what we've learned as individual institutions, but I think those could also inform more broadly higher education, what we've learned, what challenges remain now that we're back, and what opportunities there are for digital education now that we know what's possible, now that we know what we can do. How do we build digital education into our strategies as institutions, and how do we do so with considering equity and access as a big part of that, collapsing space and providing these experiences to more learners?
The last part of your question, Young, was very intriguing, which is the way I interpret is to what extent might there be opportunities for connecting the activities across universities or places of education. Today, the model is everyone is delivering all the activities, all the content by themselves to their students, right? And that model is replicated with some exceptions. I mean, you have some settings where there's consortia of universities that share content and so on. I think there's no question that got amplified during the pandemic. I mean, Harvard and MIT through edX and all the partner institutions essentially offered content for free through the edX open access program to many universities around the world, because the asynchronous content was there. There was no reason not to share that with students elsewhere. But I think your question is a great one at pushing that line of thinking further.
Yeah, and I just want to add one. I think, the institutions don't change typically. Like you're absolutely right. They don't change. I think what I was really interested in is that, during your commit meetings, did you have any brave faculty began to challenge the institutions? I don't expect Harvard to have like too many students, then you won't be Harvard anymore. You got to have, this small group. I was just wondering, anyone crazy enough on your at Stanford committee, MIT committee, or your Harvard committee say, why don't we just do this? We build a school. I mean, Yale has a little campus in Singapore, which, they doesn't recognize. So it's very interesting, but Chris has more important questions, but thank you.
Well, no, I just want to build on this. So I want to build on this, and I want to talk about history for a minute, because a decade ago, Harvard, MIT, and Stanford announced, among others, this wonderful new approach called MOOCs that was going to transform higher education with great fanfare. I'm one of the few people who's on record from the very beginning of expressing a lot of concern about the MOOC teaching and learning model, which I thought was a major regression from what we had learned in distance education. But I was fully on board, not only with the goals of recognizing that online learning can be effective, but even more with the very difficult challenge of scale, of how you literally can reach billions of learners in different places with an education that may not be of the same quality as privileged people can get with the resources that involves, but that was far better than what they had access to without that. And the MOOCs, because they came out of computer science, I would argue, had a computer scientist view of what learning is, which is about as valuable as my view of what computer science is. So what if now there was another announcement, say a year from now or 2 years from now, not from an individual university, but from a coalition that would include Stanford, MIT, Harvard, that would, in a sense, be based on this conversation, that would say there is a new model of how quality education might work at scale, not the MOOC model, but a model that builds on the best of the innovations that emerged, that emphasize things the MOOCs never thought about, this support for individuals that are struggling under adverse conditions, this strong sense of community, this strong sense of learning from each other rather than, the expert pouring knowledge into the minds of the learners. Wouldn't that be interesting? And is that a way in which, in a sense, these discussions and reports could live on past each campus, infusing some innovations into still a predominantly face-to-face model? I'm just curious as to your thoughts about that.
This is a really interesting point, Chris, and let me just pick up on this. One of the phrases that we used in the Harvard report was that, I'll just read the sentence, any meaningful expansion of Harvard's teaching and learning activities will be guided by the principle of engagement at scale, not one or the other. And I think what this conversation is suggesting and underscoring is the importance of getting both parts of that right. Clearly the lesson from the MOOC model, and by the way, to be clear, there was debates within Harvard, as Chris is alluding to, around not necessarily the aspiration of what MOOCs were trying to do, which is democratize education, but the approach, right? And different Harvard schools pursued different approaches. This was a phrase we had coined at the business school 9 years ago, or at least in the context of what we were trying to do, which is simply taking a case-based discussion process and transferring it over, as we were talking about earlier, to the online medium is just not going to work. It's just not going to engage the students. How do we engage them in a way that respects the principles of case-based education while still achieving scale? I would say historically, and many people still believe today, that digital technologies are great at achieving scale, but the residential classroom is really the best approach for engaging. And the twain shall never meet, right? I think we're now at least 10, if not 20 or 30 years down this process, where the convexity of that curve has been dramatically challenged, right? Not just through asynchronous platforms that engage, like the ones that we're familiar with and some of which we have built, but you take examples where a faculty member, Computer Science 50, taught at Harvard, live streamed into Yale, with section leaders, TFs, and so on at Yale, supplementing those lectures with small person discussions. You take cascading of learning within organizations where, leaders at the top of the organization might go for in-person education, but then you have synchronous classrooms for another 1,000 or 3,000, and then you have asynchronous learning for another 30,000. Those are all ways where I think where we can achieve engagement at scale in ways that are well past the traditional MOOC model. So, Yong, to your question, in fact, we laid out an aspiration in the Harvard report. I don't think it's about just how many people do we reach, but I think this conversation again underscores how do we reach them. I think that's really important. Because if we're going to compromise that experience of Stanford or Harvard and MIT in reaching those people, that's not a great way to reach them and teach them. And really, that was the core concept. And you might have degree students who come to campus, executive education students who come to campus for some period of time and are online for another period of time, some who are entirely online. The modalities might be just fundamentally different, but the key principle that we were at least anchoring around was in our task force discussions was engagement at scale.
Janet and Cindy, we're moving towards the end, but I'd love to get both of your takes on this issue or anything else that you want to make sure that our audience hears from you.
Just a couple quick things. One, I think this idea of looking at not so much saying, okay, this is what we're going to do. We're going to consolidate. We're going to share, or which is a great idea, but saying where does it make the most sense? Where does it have the most value? And so really looking at the kinds of learning that we want to have happen. Also, this whole idea about sometimes asynchronous delivery, asynchronous engagement is better. But we need to identify when that, be really specific about when that is, and then use it, and use it accordingly. So I think the grassroots approach is nice, but it's slow. But I think at some level that's, we have to have a need, and then we have to say, okay, let's do this, let's collaborate, let's share, and I think that's that kind of drip by drip, ball rolling down the hill phenomena in terms of getting institutions of higher learning to sort of cooperate more across boundaries of classes. The other thing is, I would say that at least at MIT, the existence of MIT X courses was a hugely important in how some faculty ended up delivering their their classes during the pandemic, right? The fact that there were these lectures online, snippets of lectures, really well crafted 8-minute videos that students could watch, really did kind of get us into that next level. I mean, it was a flipped classroom, but it became more than a substitution of a lecture, and it became a more meaningful way of engaging with students. So just a note about, I was never on the MOOC bandwagon either, but the existence of those courses was really wonderful in terms of the blended learning affordances.
And I think at Stanford, the pandemic was very disruptive and tragic and so hard for all of us. But coming out of it, there is just this real sense of optimism about what's possible when we come together and collaborate in new ways. And that's kind of lending to a lot of efforts being done in digital education right now. So sort of on the grassroots level, there's a lot of interest in kind of this more like a human element of digital education. I think that maybe wasn't so prominent in the MOOC era, but now really there's an understanding that we need to build relationships, we need to build communities as a part of these efforts. So yeah, there's a lot of exciting work being done at Stanford in that space. And then institutionally, we're really excited to build off of this pandemic report, use this as a foundation for thinking about our digital education strategy, kind of taking forward what we've learned and understanding the challenges and thinking about how we face them together moving forward. And we talked about this a little bit before the episode, but I'm really valuing the experience of talking with all of you about our reports. And I think it would be really exciting if we continued collaborating, if we somehow synthesized our learnings in these reports and thought about what this might look like, what would be our recommendations for higher education moving forward. I think that would be a very interesting conversation. And also that at Stanford, especially where we want to share out our resources about how we did this report, our interview templates, anything that would be helpful to other institutions who are interested in undertaking a similar effort, maybe not at this scale, but just reflecting on what happened and what can be learned.
So I'm going to say thank you to the three of you. I was going to ask where we are in the transformation wheel, but I'll send you an email. I'm curious where you think we are. Chris, you have a final comment before I introduce the next show?
Just to thank the three of you and to say that this has been a terrific episode. I think it'll be very thought-provoking for people who watch this, both those who've been synchronous and the many more who will be asynchronous. And I hope that more comes out of this and your efforts, and applaud the hard work that you've been doing.
Major applause. And next week, we're going to have some people that some of you may have been reading in Tech Trends, because every month that Tech Trends comes out, or every issue, they have an article about creativity. They interview different folks on creativity, and they're part of Punya Mishra's research team, in fact. Dana Hendrickson from Arizona State, a very prolific person, along with her colleague, I think her grad student, Natalie Gruber, will be joined by a school principal, Sean Hannafin, to talk about mindfulness in the schools. So next week, we're all going to be mindful. Come visit us.